Wyatt thought of Alex, of the boy's unshakable determination to protect the babies he considered his siblings. He had shown more courage and resilience than many adults, but the scars of his experiences ran deep. Wyatt knew that helping Alex rebuild his life was just as important as dismantling the network. A boy's truth. Later that afternoon, Wyatt visited Alex at the shelter. The boy was in the playroom again, watching over Layla and Malik as they played with a stack of colorful blocks. Malik clapped his tiny hands as the tower toppled, giggling with delight. Layla held her stuffed elephant tightly, her wide eyes fixed on Alex. When Alex saw Wyatt, he stood up, his expression guarded. "Did you catch him?" he asked immediately. Wyatt nodded. "We caught Calloway, and we're closing in on the rest of them, thanks to the information we found at his estate." Alex's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained cautious. "What happens now?" "We'll need you to testify," Wyatt said gently. "Your story is a big part of the case we're building, but I also wanted to let you know that you've done more than enough, Alex. Because of you, we've already found other kids who were taken. They're safe now." Alex looked down at Layla and Malik, his expression softening. "I just want to make sure they're okay," he said quietly. "They're my family." Wyatt crouched to Alex's level, his voice steady. "And you're theirs. You've done an incredible job keeping them safe, Alex. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. There are people who want to help." Rebuilding trust. Over the next few days, Wyatt worked closely with Lydia and the shelter staff to ensure Alex, Layla, and Malik received the care they needed. A counselor was brought in to help Alex process his experiences, though he was reluctant to open up at first. It took time, but gradually, Alex began to trust the people around him. Lydia also began exploring options for a permanent placement that would keep the three children together. She arranged meetings with prospective foster families, but Alex remained skeptical, his protective instincts firmly in place. "What if they're like Mrs. Halston?" he asked Wyatt one afternoon. "They're not," Wyatt assured him. "We've done thorough checks on everyone. They just want to give you and the babies a safe, loving home." Alex hesitated, his gaze flickering to Layla and Malik. "I don't want them to grow up like I did. I want them to have a real family." "And they will," Wyatt said. "But Alex, you're a part of that family too. Whoever takes you in will know how important you are to them." Facing the past. As the trial against Mrs. Halston and Calloway approached, Alex's role as a key witness became even more critical. Lydia and Wyatt worked tirelessly to prepare him, ensuring he felt supported every step of the way. The day of his testimony was overcast, the courthouse looming large and imposing. Alex sat nervously in the witness room, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. Wyatt knelt beside him, his tone gentle but firm. "You're going to do great," he said. "Just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." Alex nodded, his jaw set with determination. "For Layla and Malik," he said quietly. "And for the other kids." When Alex took the stand, his voice was steady despite the fear in his eyes. He recounted everything. The neglect at the orphanage, the abuse he witnessed, and the night he decided to run. His testimony was raw and powerful, painting a vivid picture of the horrors he and the other children endured. By the time he stepped down, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Wyatt met him outside, pride shining in his eyes. "You were incredible, Alex. You just helped make sure this never happens again." A new beginning. Months passed, and the pieces of the case continued to fall into place. Mrs. Halston, Calloway, and several others were convicted on multiple charges, their sentences ensuring they would never harm another child. The network they had built was dismantled, its members exposed and prosecuted. Meanwhile, Alex, Layla, and Malik found a home with a loving foster family who embraced them wholeheartedly. Alex, initially wary, began to open up as he saw how much the family cared for him and the babies. He started school for the first time in years, excelling in his classes and making friends. Wyatt visited often, checking in on their progress. During one visit, he found Alex sitting on the porch, reading a book to Malik, while Layla napped beside him. A chance encounter. Officer James Wyatt adjusted his rearview mirror, the low hum of his patrol car blending with the faint sounds of the city in the distance. It was a routine afternoon, the kind that passed without incident in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Greenfield Heights. Well-kept lawns, children playing tag, and the occasional elderly couple strolling hand-in-hand defined the landscape. Wyatt, a man in his mid-30s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, had been patrolling these streets for years. He enjoyed the monotony, the predictability. It was a stark contrast to the chaos he'd once faced as a rookie in the inner city. As he turned onto Cedar Lane, something caught his eye. A boy no older than 12 hurriedly crossing the street, clutching something to his chest. He was dressed in clothes that hung loosely off his thin frame, his shoes scuffed and too large. What stood out most was the intensity in his movements. Wyatt instinctively slowed his car, his years of experience telling him something wasn't right. The boy disappeared into an alley between two buildings, his shoulders hunched, as though shielding something from view. Wyatt parked his patrol car at the curb, stepping out with deliberate movements. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the alley entrance, scanning for any immediate danger. His instincts urged caution. Situations like this often led to something unexpected. The soft murmur of whimpering reached his ears, followed by a muffled coo. Wyatt's brows furrowed as he rounded the corner, his hand brushing the radio clipped to his shoulder out of habit. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. The boy sat on a crate halfway down the alley, clutching two babies, both African-American, no more than 6 months old. They were bundled in mismatched blankets, their tiny faces scrunched up, as if sensing the tension in the air. The boy, pale and gaunt, held them with the careful precision of someone much older, his arms trembling under their weight, but never loosening his grip. Wyatt took a moment to process the scene. His heart ached at the sight. The boy's clothes were tattered, his face streaked with dirt, and his eyes carried an exhaustion that no child should know. Despite this, he cradled the infants with a tenderness that was deeply moving. "Hey there," Wyatt said gently, keeping his tone low and non-threatening. The boy's head snapped up, his brown eyes wide with alarm. He clutched the babies tighter, his body shifting defensively as though preparing to flee. Wyatt raised his hands in a calming gesture. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you or take them away. I just want to make sure you're all right." The boy's gaze darted between Wyatt and the alley's exit. He was clearly calculating his odds of escape, but with two babies in his arms, running wasn't an option. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "We're fine. Just leave us alone." Wyatt took a cautious step forward. "I can see you're doing your best to take care of them, but it looks like you've had a tough time. Why don't you let me help?" The boy shook his head vehemently. "No, we don't need help. We're better off on our own." Wyatt crouched slightly, bringing himself to the boy's level. "What's your name, kid?" The boy hesitated before muttering. "Alex." "Okay, Alex," Wyatt said, his voice soft and steady. "I can tell you love those babies. You're doing a great job keeping them safe. But they look hungry, and you look like you haven't slept in days. How about I get you all something to eat? No strings attached." Alex hesitated, his arms tightening protectively around the infants. The baby on his left began to fuss, letting out a soft wail. Alex immediately started bouncing her gently, murmuring soothing words. The sight tugged at Wyatt's heartstrings. "I promise," Wyatt said. "I'm not here to take them from you. I just want to help. You can trust me." For a long moment, Alex stared at Wyatt, the conflict in his eyes clear. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Okay, but just food. Nothing else." "Deal," Wyatt said with a reassuring smile. He pulled his radio to his lips and called for backup, requesting food, baby supplies, and a female officer for support. As the dispatcher confirmed, Alex's shoulders visibly relaxed, though his grip on the babies didn't waver. Wyatt sat cross-legged on the pavement, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't want to overwhelm Alex, who was clearly on edge. "So, Alex," he began conversationally, "are these your siblings?" Alex's eyes flickered with something. Defiance, maybe. "Yeah," he said firmly. "This is Layla and Malik." Wyatt noted the names with a nod. "They're lucky to have a big brother like you. How old are you, Alex?" 12. 12, Wyatt repeated, his tone light but tinged with disbelief. "That's a lot of responsibility for someone your age. How long have you been taking care of them?" Alex hesitated, his gaze dropping to the babies. Since they came to the orphanage." The word hit Wyatt like a punch to the gut. He'd heard horror stories about overcrowded, underfunded orphanages, but seeing the evidence firsthand was another matter entirely. "The orphanage," he echoed. "Is that where you all came from?" Alex nodded, his jaw tightening. "Willow Creek home. But it's not really a home. Not for kids like them." Wyatt's brow furrowed. "Kids like them." Alex's voice hardened, and for the first time, anger crept into his tone. "Mrs. Halston, the lady in charge, she hates them. She says they're too different. She put them in the coldest room, barely fed them, and told the other kids to stay away." Wyatt felt his stomach churn. He'd dealt with neglect cases before, but hearing it described by a child made it all the more gut-wrenching. "That's terrible," he said softly. "Is that why you left?" Alex nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "She said she was gonna send them away. Said no one would want them. I couldn't let that happen. They're my family." Wyatt felt a lump form in his throat. The determination in Alex's voice, the raw emotion. It was clear he'd gone to unimaginable lengths to protect these babies. "You're very brave, Alex," he said. "It takes a lot of courage to stand up for someone you love." The sound of approaching sirens broke the moment, and Alex flinched, his arms tightening around the babies. Wyatt quickly raised a hand to reassure him. "It's okay. That's just backup. They're bringing food and supplies, like I promised." As the police SUV pulled up, Wyatt kept his focus on Alex, making sure he didn't feel overwhelmed. A female officer emerged, carrying a bag of groceries and a box of baby formula. She approached slowly, her kind smile putting Alex slightly at ease. "Hi, Alex," she said gently. "I'm Officer Kate. I brought some food for you and the babies. Is that okay?" Alex nodded hesitantly, his grip on the babies loosening just enough to adjust their blankets. Wyatt stepped aside as Kate knelt in front of Alex, handing him a sandwich and a bottle of water. "Here," she said. "Eat up. You need your strength to take care of Layla and Malik." As Alex devoured the sandwich, Wyatt and Kate exchanged a glance. Both knew this was just the beginning. There was more to Alex's story, and uncovering it would take time. But for now, ensuring the safety of all three children was the top priority. Wyatt crouched beside Alex, his voice soft but firm. "You're safe now," he said. "No one's going to hurt you or these babies ever again." For the first time, Alex allowed himself to relax. His shoulders sagged, the weight of his burden finally easing, if only a little. And as Layla cooed softly in his arms, Wyatt knew one thing for certain. This boy's love for these babies was unshakable. The silent guardian. Alex sat cross-legged on the pavement of the alley, feeding Layla from a baby bottle Officer Kate had provided. Malik dozed peacefully in his other arm, his tiny hand clutching a fold of Alex's oversized shirt. Officer Wyatt and Kate remained nearby, giving Alex the space he needed. The soft whimper of the sirens in the background had faded, leaving only the quiet murmur of birds in the distance and the occasional rustle of wind. Wyatt observed Alex carefully. The boy had a steeliness to him that didn't belong to a 12-year-old. It was the look of someone who had faced far more hardship than anyone his age should. Alex's movements were deliberate, each action precise as though he were accustomed to operating under constant pressure. Wyatt exchanged a glance with Kate, who seemed just as moved by the scene unfolding before them. "You've got away with them," Wyatt remarked gently, hoping to spark conversation. "Layla looks content, and Malik hasn't made a peep. You've been doing this for a while, huh?" Alex nodded but didn't look up. "I've been taking care of them since they arrived at the orphanage. They're my responsibility." Kate crouched nearby, her expression warm but concerned. "Alex, you're doing such a great job looking after them, but you shouldn't have to do this alone. Can you tell us more about what happened at the orphanage? We want to help you." Alex hesitated, his fingers adjusting the bottle in Layla's mouth. She made soft cooing noises as she drank, her tiny fingers reaching up to grasp at Alex's hand. The boy's expression softened as he looked down at her, but the hardness quickly returned when he glanced back at the officers. "You'll just take them away," Alex said, his voice low but firm. "You'll split us up. I can't let that happen." Wyatt's chest tightened at the boy's words. He crouched down to Alex's level, his tone steady. "I understand why you'd think that, Alex, but I promise we're not here to take them away from you. We want to make sure all three of you are safe. That's it." Alex studied Wyatt for a long moment, his sharp, distrustful eyes boring into the officer's calm gaze. Finally, he sighed, the weight of his exhaustion evident. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll tell you. But only if you promise they won't go back to that place." Kate leaned in slightly, her voice gentle. "We'll do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. Just tell us what you've been through." Alex shifted Malik in his arm, gently laying the sleeping baby across his lap while holding Layla closer. His voice was soft at first, almost hesitant, but as the words spilled out, they gained momentum, his pent-up frustration and pain bubbling to the surface. "They came 6 months ago," Alex began, glancing at Layla as she finished the last of the bottle. He wiped her tiny mouth with the edge of her blanket. "Layla and Malik. The orphanage was already overcrowded, and Mrs. Halston didn't like new arrivals. She said they were more mouths to feed and more trouble to deal with. But she treated them worse than anyone else." Alex paused, his jaw tightening. The other kids noticed. They'd pick on them, pull Layla's hair, or hide Malik's blanket so he'd cry all night. Mrs. Halston didn't stop them. She laughed. She said they needed to toughen up. His voice cracked slightly, and he swallowed hard. "I tried to stop it, but I'm just one person. I'd sneak into the kitchen to make extra bottles for them when she didn't feed them enough. I gave them my blankets when it got cold." Kate's face grew pale, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Wyatt felt his own anger rising, but kept his voice calm. "That's a lot for one person to handle, Alex, especially someone your age. But you didn't have to do it alone. Why didn't you tell anyone?" Alex shook his head, his eyes dark with bitterness. "Tell who? Mrs. Halston ran the place. She decides everything. If I said anything, she'd make things worse for them. And for me." Kate leaned forward slightly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Alex, what you've been doing for them is incredible. But no child should have to take on that kind of responsibility. You deserve a safe place too." Alex ignored her comment, pressing on with his story. "A few days ago, I heard Mrs. Halston talking on the phone. She said she'd finally found someone to take them off her hands. She said it like they were garbage, like they didn't matter." His voice grew louder, more defiant. "I couldn't let her send them away. I knew she didn't care where they went. It could have been somewhere worse." Wyatt's brow furrowed. "What do you mean by worse?" Alex's eyes flickered with fear and anger. "Sometimes people come to the orphanage, but they're not looking to adopt. They just want to take kids to places, bad places. Mrs. Halston doesn't care, as long as they pay. She says they're not her problem once they leave." Kate gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Wyatt felt his stomach churn. He'd heard rumors of such things happening, but hearing it firsthand from a child was different. It was sickening. That's when I decided. Alex continued, his voice firm. I waited until everyone was asleep. I packed the formula I'd hidden, 2 bottles, some diapers, and the only blanket I had left. I took the keys from her office and unlocked their room. Alex's voice softened as he looked down at Malik. They were so scared. Layla wouldn't stop crying, and Malik was shaking. But I told them it would be okay. I told them I'd keep them safe. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time, he looked vulnerable. Wyatt placed a steady hand on Alex's shoulder. You did an amazing thing, Alex. You risked everything to protect them. That's what a real hero does. Alex's story wasn't over. He described how he'd carried the babies out of the orphanage, sneaking through the broken latch on the kitchen door. He'd walked all night, staying in the shadows to avoid being seen. By morning, his legs felt like lead, but he kept moving, stopping only when he found the alley where Wyatt had found him. I didn't know what else to do, Alex admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I just needed to get away. Wyatt nodded, his respect for the boy growing with every word. You did the best you could, Alex. And now that we know what's been happening, we can make sure Mrs. Halston doesn't hurt anyone else. Alex's head shot up, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. You promise? Wyatt met his gaze, his voice firm. I promise. But we'll need your help. If you're willing, we'll need you to tell us everything so we can build a case against her. Alex hesitated, glancing down at the babies in his lap. He stroked Layla's cheek gently, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he nodded. I'll do it, but only if you promise they'll be safe. They will be, Kate said softly. We'll make sure of it. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the alley, Wyatt knew this was only the beginning. Alex's story was heartbreaking, but it was also a call to action. He and Kate would make sure these children got the justice they deserved, and the safety they so desperately needed. For now, though, their priority was clear: keeping Alex, Layla, and Malik safe. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The depths of resilience. The shadows in the alley grew longer as Alex's story unraveled further, his voice wavering yet determined. Wyatt and Kate remained silent, their presence a quiet reassurance as Alex revealed details of his journey, a desperate struggle for survival that defied his young age. The long night. I waited until the night guard passed, Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. He always stops for a smoke break near the back gate. That's when I knew I had to go. He described how he crept through the orphanage halls, the old wooden floors creaking beneath his cautious steps. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it might wake the other children. Clutched tightly in his small hands was the rusted ring of keys he'd taken from Mrs. Halston's office, a risky theft that could have earned him severe punishment if caught. I unlocked their room first, Alex continued, his gaze distant as if reliving the moment. Layla and Malik were both crying, but they stopped when they saw me. I whispered to them to be quiet, but I think they understood. It was like they knew we were escaping. The children had been confined in a small windowless storage room, their cribs replaced with thin mats on the cold floor. The sight had nearly broken Alex, but he knew he couldn't fall apart. Not then. Not with so much at stake. I wrapped them in blankets and held them as tight as I could. Alex said, his arms tightening around the now sleeping Malik, as though he were back in that moment. Then I slipped out through the kitchen door. The latch was broken. Mrs. Halston always said it wasn't worth fixing. Lucky for me. The alley fell silent as Alex paused, his voice catching in his throat. Wyatt waited patiently, sensing that the boy needed a moment to collect himself. Kate reached into the bag she'd brought, pulling out a second sandwich and offering it to Alex. He accepted it with a nod, his hands trembling slightly as he took a bite. The endless road. Alex resumed his story after a few moments, his voice steadier now. We walked all night. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to get as far away as possible. The city was unfamiliar to Alex. The winding streets and towering buildings made him feel small and lost. But he pressed on, driven by sheer willpower and the weight of the tiny lives depending on him. He stopped only to adjust the blankets or to feed Layla and Malik from the bottles he'd brought, rationing the formula with painstaking care. I saw people, but I couldn't trust anyone, Alex admitted. What if they sent us back? What if they were like Mrs. Halston? The thought of being separated from the babies was unbearable. He avoided well-lit streets and crowded areas, slipping through alleys and hiding whenever he heard voices or footsteps. His legs ached, and his arms burned from carrying the infants, but he refused to stop. I thought about leaving them somewhere safe, Alex confessed, his voice thick with emotion. A church or a hospital. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave them. They're all I have. Wyatt felt a lump in his throat as he listened. The boy's resilience and selflessness were astonishing, but it was heartbreaking to think of how much he'd endured. The turning point. By dawn, Alex's strength was nearly gone. He found a quiet corner behind a dumpster and sank to the ground, cradling the babies as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. I didn't know what to do, Alex said, his voice trembling. Layla was crying, and Malik wouldn't wake up. I thought I'd failed them. Tears welled in Alex's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, his jaw tightening. That's when I saw you, he said, looking at Wyatt. I thought about running, but I couldn't. I didn't have the strength, and even if I did, where would we go? Wyatt nodded slowly, his heart heavy. You made the right choice, Alex. Reaching out for help doesn't mean you failed. It means you did everything you could. Alex looked down at the sleeping babies, his fingers gently brushing a strand of Layla's hair from her face. I just want them to be safe, he whispered. That's all that matters. The system's failures. As Alex spoke, it became increasingly clear that the orphanage wasn't just negligent. It was a dangerous environment that had systematically failed its children. Wyatt and Kate exchanged troubled glances, both of them silently vowing to act. We'll need to investigate the orphanage, Wyatt said carefully. Everything you've told us lines up with complaints we've heard before, but your testimony will be important, Alex. You're brave for speaking up. Alex's face hardened. I don't care what happens to me, he said fiercely. Just don't let them hurt Layla and Malik. We won't, Kate assured him. But we want to make sure you're safe too. Alex, you've done so much for them, but you need someone to look out for you too. For the first time, Alex looked uncertain. His gaze flickered between Wyatt and Kate, his protective instincts battling with the exhaustion etched into every fiber of his being. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said quietly. I'll help. A glimmer of hope. The sirens that had once unsettled Alex now brought a strange sense of relief as an unmarked van pulled up at the alley's entrance. A social worker stepped out, her expression kind but professional. She carried a bag filled with baby supplies and offered a warm smile as she approached. Hi, Alex, she said gently. My name is Lydia. I'm here to help you and the babies. Alex stiffened at first, but Wyatt placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It's okay, Alex. She's here to make sure you all get what you need. Lydia crouched down, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She handed Alex a small teddy bear, which he hesitated before accepting. I brought some formula and diapers for Layla and Malik, she said, and I've arranged for a safe place where you can all stay together. Together? Alex asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. You mean they won't take them away from me? Lydia smiled. That's right. You're their family, Alex, and we're going to make sure you stay that way. The first step forward. As the evening deepened, Alex finally allowed himself to relax, if only slightly. Wyatt helped him into the van, where a soft blanket and pillows had been prepared for the three of them. Layla and Malik stirred briefly but quickly settled, their tiny faces peaceful for the first time in days. Wyatt watched as the van pulled away, his heart heavy but hopeful. "This is just the beginning," he said to Kate. "There's a lot of work to do, but I think Alex will be okay." Kate nodded, her expression resolute. "And we'll make sure Mrs. Halston pays for what she's done. No child should ever go through what Alex has." Wyatt's gaze lingered on the retreating van. "Alex has been through more than most adults," he said quietly, "but he's still standing. If anyone can make it through this, it's him." As the alley fell silent once more, Wyatt and Kate turned back toward their patrol car, ready to begin the next phase of their mission. Justice for Alex, Layla, and Malik, and for every child who had suffered in silence. Shadows of the orphanage. The following morning, Officer Wyatt sat at his desk in the Greenfield Heights precinct, sifting through reports. The file on Willow Creek Home for Children sat open in front of him, its contents as grim as Alex's story had suggested. Multiple complaints had been filed over the years, claims of neglect, poor living conditions, and inappropriate disciplinary practices, but none had resulted in action. Each complaint had been buried under mountains of bureaucratic delays, dismissed as exaggerations, or mysteriously withdrawn. Wyatt tapped his pen against the desk, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The system had failed Alex, Layla, Malik, and who knew how many others. He glanced at the clock, noting it was just past 9 o'clock, and Lydia, the social worker who had taken Alex and the babies into protective care, had promised to call with an update. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. Wyatt snatched it up, his voice brisk but warm. "Wyatt here." "Officer Wyatt, it's Lydia," came the familiar, gentle voice. "I wanted to let you know that Alex, Layla, and Malik are safe. They spent the night in a family shelter we've partnered with." Alex was hesitant at first, but he finally fell asleep around midnight. "The babies are doing well too." Relief flooded Wyatt's chest. "That's good to hear. Alex deserves some peace after everything he's been through." Lydia's tone grew serious. "He's an incredible kid, but he's carrying a lot of emotional weight. He stayed awake for hours, watching over the babies. He's terrified that if he lets his guard down, something will happen to them." Wyatt sighed, his grip on the phone tightening. "We need to ensure they're never in a position like that again." "Did Alex say anything more about Mrs. Halston or the orphanage?" "Yes," Lydia replied. "He opened up a bit more this morning. He mentioned that Mrs. Halston had a group of men visit the orphanage every few weeks. He didn't know who they were, but he said she always seemed nervous around them. He overheard her once, saying something about selling off the hard cases." Wyatt's blood ran cold. The implications were dark and horrifying. "We need to investigate this immediately." Lydia's voice softened. "Alex is willing to share more, but he's scared. He needs to feel safe before he'll talk about anything else." Wyatt nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'll visit him today. In the meantime, I'll start digging into those complaints and see what I can uncover." A visit with Alex. By late afternoon, Wyatt found himself pulling up to the shelter. It was a modest building tucked into a quiet neighborhood, its brick exterior clean but unassuming. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming, with bright murals on the walls and the soft hum of children's laughter in the distance. Lydia greeted him at the entrance. "Alex is in the playroom with Layla and Malik. He's still on edge, but I think seeing you will help." Wyatt followed her down a short hallway to a spacious room filled with toys, books, and colorful rugs. Alex sat cross-legged on the floor, cradling Malik, while Layla lay on a blanket beside him, clutching the stuffed elephant. Despite the cheerful surroundings, Alex's posture was tense, his gaze darting toward the door as Wyatt entered. "Hey, Alex," Wyatt said softly, crouching to his level. "How are you holding up?" Alex shrugged, his expression guarded. "We're fine." Wyatt sat down a few feet away, careful not to invade Alex's space. "Lydia told me you've been helping take care of Layla and Malik here. They look happy." "They're okay," Alex said, his voice clipped. "For now." Wyatt studied the boy, his heart aching at the weight of responsibility he carried. "I know it's hard to trust people after what you've been through," he said gently. "But I'm here to help. We're going to make sure you're all safe, and we're going to stop Mrs. Halston from hurting anyone else." Alex's eyes narrowed. "How?" "She's been doing this for years, and nobody's stopped her." "Because no one's had the courage to speak up like you have," Wyatt replied firmly. "Your story matters, Alex. With your help, we can build a case against her. But I need to know everything you can tell me about what's been happening at Willow Creek." Alex hesitated, his arms tightening around Malik. For a moment, Wyatt thought he might refuse. But then Alex took a deep breath, his expression hardening with determination. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll tell you. A house of secrets." Alex's voice was steady, but his words painted a harrowing picture. He described how Mrs. Halston maintained a facade of order and care for visiting inspectors and donors. The orphanage's public areas were clean and well kept, but behind closed doors, it was a different story. She only cared about the kids she thought people would adopt, Alex explained. The babies who looked perfect, the little kids who were easy to handle. But the rest of us, we didn't matter. He spoke of long, cold nights in overcrowded dorms, meager meals that left them hungry, and punishments that bordered on cruel. Mrs. Halston would lock misbehaving children in the basement, a dark, damp space that Alex described as worse than a cage. "It wasn't just the punishments," Alex added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was the people who came to visit. Men in suits, women in fancy clothes. They'd walk around, looking at us like we weren't even human." Wyatt's stomach churned. "Do you remember anything specific about them? Names, faces, anything?" Alex shook his head. "Mrs. Halston didn't let us get close. But I know they took kids. She'd pick the ones who didn't have family, the ones no one would miss." Wyatt felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm for Alex's sake. "You've done the right thing by telling me this," he said. "Every detail helps. Building the case." Over the next few hours, Wyatt and Lydia worked with Alex to document everything he could remember. The boy's resilience was astounding, but Wyatt could see the strain it placed on him. By the time they finished, Alex looked utterly drained. "You've been incredibly brave," Wyatt said, resting a hand on Alex's shoulder. "We're going to use this information to make sure Mrs. Halston never hurts another child. But you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. We're here for you." Alex nodded silently, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but tinged with hope. For the first time, he allowed Lydia to take Malik from his arms, trusting her to care for the baby while he rested. As Wyatt left the shelter that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Alex's testimony was just the beginning, but it was a powerful foundation. There were still questions to answer, evidence to uncover, and justice to pursue. A growing threat. Back at the precinct, Wyatt began sifting through the records of Willow Creek Home. The deeper he dug, the more troubling patterns emerged. Financial irregularities, sudden staff turnover, a web of red tape that seemed designed to obscure the truth. As Wyatt pieced together the puzzle, one thing became clear. Mrs. Halston wasn't acting alone. There was a network at play, one that profited from exploiting vulnerable children. And if they realized the walls were closing in, they wouldn't go down without a fight. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight with determination. Alex, Layla, and Malik deserved justice, and he wasn't going to stop until they got it. Cracks in the facade. The next morning, Officer Wyatt stood outside the imposing gates of Willow Creek Home for Children. The orphanage was a 2-story Victorian structure, its weathered paint and creaking wooden sign betraying years of neglect. To a casual observer, it might seem charming, even picturesque, but Wyatt now knew better. Beneath its outward appearance lay a darkness that had festered for years. Accompanying Wyatt was Detective Elena Price, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for uncovering hidden truths. Dressed in a tailored blazer, she carried an air of quiet authority. Alina had reviewed Alex's testimony that morning and arrived ready to dig deeper into the tangled web of corruption and abuse that surrounded Willow Creek. "Let's see what we're dealing with," Wyatt said, pushing open the heavy iron gate. The creak of the hinges was loud in the still morning air. As they approached the front door, a woman in her late 50s stepped out to greet them. Her name was Mrs. Halston, and her sharp bird-like features were framed by an immaculate silver bun. She wore a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes, her posture stiff and defensive. "Officers," she said crisply, her tone betraying no warmth. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We're here to conduct an investigation," Alina said, flashing her badge. "We've received reports of potential misconduct at this facility." Mrs. Halston's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Misconduct? That's absurd. This is a well-respected establishment. I assure you, all of our children are well cared for." Wyatt's jaw tightened, but he maintained a neutral expression. "We'd like to take a look around and speak to some of the children." Mrs. Halston hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm afraid that won't be possible without proper documentation. You understand, we have to protect the privacy of our residents." Alina stepped forward, her voice firm. "This isn't a courtesy call, Mrs. Halston. We have the authority to investigate, and will proceed with or without your cooperation." The older woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but she stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "Very well, but I expect you to conduct yourselves professionally. The children here have been through enough." Behind closed doors, the interior of the orphanage was as deceptive as its exterior. The front parlor was neatly arranged with comfortable furniture and cheerful decorations, designed to impress visitors. A group of children sat at a table, coloring quietly under the supervision of a young staff member. Their faces lit up when they saw the officers, but a sharp glance from Mrs. Halston made them lower their eyes. Wyatt exchanged a glance with Alina. The atmosphere was stifling, the air heavy with unspoken fear. They began their tour, moving from room to room under Mrs. Halston's watchful eye. "Everything seems in order," Mrs. Halston said as they passed through the dining area. "Our staff works tirelessly to ensure the children are well fed and comfortable." But Wyatt noticed the cracks in her facade. The dining chairs were mismatched, some wobbly and clearly in need of repair. The kitchen, though tidy, lacked fresh produce or substantial food supplies. It was all surface-level cleanliness, masking the deeper neglect. "Mind if we check the living quarters?" Wyatt asked casually. Mrs. Halston hesitated again, but her forced smile remained. "Of course. Right this way." She led them to the dormitories, where rows of narrow beds lined the walls. The rooms were sparse, with threadbare blankets and dim lighting. Wyatt's eyes immediately went to the far corner, where two cribs were placed apart from the other sleeping areas. They were older, rusted, and barely functional. "These cribs," Alina said, her voice sharp. "Why are they isolated from the rest?" Mrs. Halston's expression didn't waver. "Those were for two infants who required special care. They've recently been placed in foster care." Wyatt's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice neutral. "We'll need the records for those placements." Mrs. Halston's composure cracked slightly, her fingers twitching as she folded her hands. "Of course. I'll have my assistant gather them for you." Hidden truths. As they continued their inspection, Wyatt noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others, older with scratches around the frame. A padlock secured it firmly in place. "What's in there?" Wyatt asked, nodding toward the door. Mrs. Halston stiffened. "That's just a storage room. It's not in use." "We'd like to see it," Alina said, her voice cool and authoritative. Mrs. Halston hesitated, her smile now completely gone. "I don't have the key on me." Wyatt stepped closer, his gaze unrelenting. "Then we'll find another way in." Alina radioed for a locksmith while Wyatt remained by the door, his instincts telling him they were on the verge of uncovering something significant. Mrs. Halston stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly, her earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. The basement revelation. When the locksmith arrived, it took only a few minutes to bypass the padlock. Wyatt and Elena stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the dim, musty air. What they found made their blood run cold. The room was small and bare, its concrete floor cold and unwelcoming. In the corner were several tattered mattresses, stained and reeking of mildew. Scattered around the room were broken toys and torn clothing, evidence of children who had been confined here. Wyatt's stomach churned as he imagined Alex, Layla, and Malik enduring such conditions. Elena knelt to examine the items, her face grim. "This isn't a storage room," she said. "It's a holding cell." Mrs. Halston, who had reluctantly followed them, tried to defend herself. "It's not what it looks like," she said hastily. "Some of the children, they have behavioral issues. This is where we give them time to calm down." Wyatt turned to her, his voice low and dangerous. "You mean you lock them in here like animals?" Mrs. Halston's face flushed, but she said nothing. Elena stood, her expression steely. "We're shutting this place down. Effective immediately." The network unveiled. As Wyatt and Elena left the orphanage, Mrs. Halston was escorted into a police car for further questioning. But Wyatt knew she was just one piece of the puzzle. Back at the precinct, he and Elena pored over the files they'd collected, connecting the dots between financial records, missing children, and suspicious visitors. It became clear that Willow Creek was part of a larger operation, a network that exploited vulnerable children for profit. Wyatt's hands shook with rage as he uncovered records of payments to untraceable accounts, vague adoption agreements, and forged documentation. "We've got enough to start pulling this operation apart," Elena said, her voice filled with determination. "But it's going to take time." Wyatt nodded, his mind racing. "We'll start with Mrs. Halston. If she's smart, she'll talk to save herself. And if she doesn't—" He paused, his expression hardening. "We'll find another way. A step toward justice." Late that night, Wyatt visited the shelter to check on Alex. The boy was sitting in a rocking chair, Malik asleep in his arms. Layla dozed nearby, her tiny hand clutching Alex's shirt. "They're safe now," Wyatt said softly, sitting beside him. "Mrs. Halston's been arrested. She won't hurt anyone else." Alex looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "What about the others?" "The kid's still at the orphanage." "We're working on it," Wyatt assured him. "And thanks to you, we have the evidence we need to make sure this doesn't happen again." For the first time, Alex allowed himself to smile, a small tentative expression that spoke of hope beginning to bloom. Wyatt knew the road ahead would be long, but he also knew they had taken a crucial step toward justice. As Alex leaned back, his eyes drifting closed, Wyatt felt a deep sense of resolve. He would see this through, not just for Alex, Layla, and Malik, but for every child who had suffered in silence. A new resolve. After leaving the shelter, Wyatt returned to the precinct, his mind still buzzing with everything they had uncovered. The discovery in the locked basement, combined with Alex's testimony, painted a grim picture of the horrors at Willow Creek. But Wyatt knew this was just the beginning. Mrs. Halston wasn't working alone, and the network behind her operation needed to be dismantled. Wyatt stepped into the conference room, where Detective Elena Price was still poring over documents. The walls were now covered with hastily tacked-up photographs, timelines, and sticky notes, everything they had gathered from their investigation so far. Elena looked up as Wyatt entered. "I just got off the phone with the prosecutor's office," she said. "They've approved a warrant to search Mrs. Halston's financial records. If we can tie those payments to specific cases, we'll have more than enough to bring down anyone connected to this." Wyatt nodded, his expression grim. "It's not just about the money. We need to find the kids she's already sent away. If Alex is right, some of them might be in serious danger." Elena sighed, leaning back in her chair. "That's the hard part. We have incomplete records, missing files. It's a mess. But there's one lead I think we should prioritize. She pointed to a grainy photograph of a middle-aged man stepping out of a black SUV. This is Richard Calloway. He visited the orphanage twice in the last month. Alex mentioned seeing him talking to Mrs. Halston late at night. Wyatt frowned. What do we know about him? Not much, Alina admitted. But he's connected to a private adoption agency with a history of irregularities. It's called New Horizons Adoptions. They specialize in placing hard-to-place children. But there's no transparency about where those kids end up. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Let's find out. Uncovering the network. Wyatt and Alina spent the next several hours digging into New Horizons. The agency's public-facing operations appeared legitimate, but a deeper dive revealed troubling inconsistencies. Some of the children listed as placed in their records were still missing, and several of the adoption agreements were linked to fake addresses. This isn't just negligence, Alina said, her voice tense as she scrolled through the data. They're deliberately hiding these kids. Wyatt stared at the screen, his fists clenching. What's the connection to Mrs. Halston? Alina clicked through a series of files, her brow furrowing. Here, she said, pointing to a document. Mrs. Halston received a series of payments from New Horizons over the past year. Each payment lines up with a child who was supposedly adopted from Willow Creek. Wyatt's stomach turned. It's a trafficking operation, he said grimly. They're selling these kids under the guise of adoption. Alina nodded, her face pale. And Mrs. Halston was the gatekeeper. She identified the vulnerable ones, the ones with no family, no one to ask questions, and handed them over. Wyatt took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. We need to act fast. If they suspect we're onto them, they'll destroy evidence, or worse, move the kids. Closing in. By dawn, Wyatt and Alina had enough evidence to raid the New Horizons office. A team of officers accompanied them as they stormed the small, nondescript building in the industrial district. Inside, they found stacks of files, computer servers, and a handful of employees who looked more nervous than surprised. As the officers began cataloging evidence, Wyatt's attention was drawn to a locked filing cabinet in the corner. "What's in here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. One of the employees, a wiry man in his 40s, stammered. I don't know. The director keeps those locked." Wyatt didn't wait for further explanation. He signaled for a locksmith, who arrived moments later to crack the cabinet open. Inside were folders labeled with names and numbers, dozens of them. Wyatt pulled out the first file, his heart sinking as he scanned the contents. Each folder contained a photograph of a child, along with basic information: name, age, health status. The final pages were contracts, signed agreements transferring custody to unnamed parties. Alina flipped through another file, her expression hardening. "These aren't adoptions," she said. "They're sales." Wyatt's grip on the folder tightened. "We need to find these kids. Every single one of them." A glimmer of hope. Back at the precinct, the team worked tirelessly to cross-reference the files with missing persons reports and adoption records. Wyatt felt a surge of relief when one of the analysts shouted, "We've got a match." The analyst held up a photograph of a young boy with bright eyes and a wide smile. "This is Caleb Harris, reported missing 2 years ago. His family never stopped looking for him." Wyatt felt a rare spark of hope. "Let's get them on the phone. If we can reunite even one family, this will be worth it." Over the next several hours, more matches emerged. Each one brought a mix of joy and sorrow. Joy for the children who could be found, and sorrow for those who remained unaccounted for. A reunion. Later that evening, Wyatt returned to the shelter to share the news with Alex. The boy was in the playroom, helping Layla stack colorful blocks while Malik crawled nearby. Despite the heaviness of the past few days, Alex seemed lighter, as though the weight of constant vigilance had begun to lift. "Hey, Alex," Wyatt said, kneeling beside him. "We found something today. It's because of you." Alex looked up, his eyes wide. "What did you find?" Wyatt smiled. "We found some of the kids Mrs. Halston sent away. They're going home to their families." For a moment, Alex just stared at him, as if struggling to process the words. Then he smiled, a real bright smile that transformed his face. "Really? Really?" Wyatt said. "And it's because you were brave enough to speak up." Alex's smile faded slightly. "What about Layla and Malik? Do they have a family?" Wyatt hesitated, knowing how much Alex cared for the babies. "Right now, their family is you, and we'll make sure you stay together as long as that's what you want." Alex nodded firmly. "It is." The next step. As Wyatt left the shelter that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. There was still so much work to be done, more children to find, more predators to bring to justice. But for the first time, it felt possible. The road ahead would be long and grueling, but Wyatt knew one thing for certain. They were on the right path. And with Alex's courage lighting the way, there was no challenge they couldn't face. The web unravels. The precinct buzzed with an intensity Officer Wyatt hadn't seen in years. Phones rang incessantly, keyboards clicked, and officers darted between desks clutching stacks of files. The raid on New Horizons adoptions had revealed more than Wyatt and Detective Elena Price had anticipated. What they initially thought was a localized operation had begun to show signs of being part of a sprawling child trafficking network. Wyatt stood at the center of the chaos, sifting through files and coordinating with other precincts. Beside him, Elena was on the phone with federal agents, briefing them on the case. She hung up and turned to Wyatt, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "They're sending a task force to help us," Elena said. "But we've got a limited window. If this network realizes we're closing in, they'll scatter like cockroaches." Wyatt nodded, his jaw tight. "We've already seen how careful they are. They've erased most of their digital tracks. But we've still got one lead. Richard Calloway." Elena frowned. "He's been dodging us since the raid. His phone is off, and his last known address is a dead end. We need to find him before he disappears completely." A cryptic lead. As Wyatt prepared to leave the precinct, his phone buzzed. It was Lydia, the social worker who had been caring for Alex, Layla, and Malik. He answered immediately, sensing urgency in her call. "Wyatt," Lydia said, her voice low. "Alex has been asking a lot of questions. He overheard something at the shelter about the investigation. He thinks Calloway might be someone he saw at the orphanage." Wyatt's grip on the phone tightened. "Did he say anything specific?" "He didn't know his name," Lydia replied. "But he described a man who matches Calloway's profile. Middle-aged, graying hair, always wearing a suit. Alex said he saw him arguing with Mrs. Halston one night. He thinks the man was angry because she couldn't deliver on something." Wyatt's mind raced. If Alex had seen Calloway, it meant the man was more deeply involved than they had realized. "I'll come by the shelter," he said. "I need to ask Alex a few more questions." A boy's courage. At the shelter, Wyatt found Alex sitting cross-legged on the floor, building a tower of blocks for Malik to knock over. Layla sat nearby, clutching her stuffed elephant and watching intently. When Alex noticed Wyatt, he stood, his expression wary but curious. "Hi, Alex," Wyatt said, crouching to his level. "I need your help again. You mentioned seeing a man at the orphanage, the one who argued with Mrs. Halston. Can you tell me more about what you saw?" Alex glanced at the babies, his protective instincts evident. After a moment, he nodded. "It was late," he began. "I wasn't supposed to be out of bed, but Layla was crying, and I went to get her a bottle. I heard voices in Mrs. Halston's office, so I hid in the hallway." "What did you hear?" Wyatt asked gently. "They were arguing," Alex said. "The man said something about a deadline. He told her she was getting sloppy and that it was going to cost them. She looked scared." Wyatt exchanged a glance with Lydia, who stood nearby, listening intently. "Do you remember anything else he said?" Alex hesitated, then nodded. He said something about moving the product. He said if she couldn't handle it, he'd find someone who could. Wyatt's stomach churned. The term product made it clear they weren't just talking about children. They were dehumanizing them entirely. "You did great, Alex," he said. "That information is really important." Alex's expression was conflicted. "You're going to catch him, right? He's not going to hurt anyone else." "We're doing everything we can," Wyatt promised. "And you've helped us a lot by telling me this." Tracking Calloway. With Alex's account in hand, Wyatt returned to the precinct. Elena had already begun piecing together Calloway's financial records, looking for any clue that might lead them to his whereabouts. As they worked, an officer approached with a printout. "We got a hit on Calloway's car," the officer said. "It was spotted leaving a private airstrip just outside the city 2 days ago." Wyatt frowned. "Do we know where he was headed?" The officer shook his head. "No flight plans filed, but we're checking nearby properties he might own." Elena leaned over her laptop. "Wait, he might not have gone far." She pulled up a series of transactions linked to one of Calloway's shell companies. "There's a payment to a security firm for a property upstate, an old estate in the middle of nowhere." Wyatt grabbed his jacket. "That's our next stop. The estate." Wyatt and Elena, along with a team of officers, approached the estate under the cover of night. The sprawling property was surrounded by dense woods, its gates secured with high-tech surveillance cameras. A single light burned in the main house, and several SUVs were parked in the driveway. "This is it," Elena whispered. "If Calloway's here, he's not alone." The team moved in silently, cutting the power to the property before breaching the gates. Wyatt's heart pounded as they cleared the house, room by room. Inside, they found stacks of documents, burner phones, and a laptop, but no sign of Calloway. Then, in the basement, they found something chilling. A row of small cots, each with a blanket folded neatly on top. It was clear the space had been used to house children, though it was now empty. "He's moving them," Wyatt said, his voice filled with urgency. "He knows we're onto him." A desperate chase. As the officers searched the property, a noise outside caught Wyatt's attention. A car engine revving in the distance. He sprinted to the driveway just in time to see a black SUV speeding away. "That's him," Wyatt shouted, jumping into his car with Elena close behind. The chase was intense, the SUV weaving recklessly through the winding back roads. Wyatt gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes locked on the taillights ahead. Elena radioed for backup, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through them. As they closed the distance, the SUV skidded off the road and into a ditch. Wyatt and Elena approached cautiously, weapons drawn. Calloway stumbled out, his face pale and his hands raised. "It's over," Wyatt said, his voice cold. "Where are the kids?" Calloway sneered, his confidence faltering. "You're too late," he spat. "They're already gone." Wyatt's blood boiled, but he kept his composure. "We'll find them. And when we do, you'll pay for everything you've done." A breakthrough. Back at the precinct, Calloway refused to cooperate, but the evidence recovered from the estate provided a breakthrough. Emails on his laptop revealed the locations of several other properties linked to the network. Teams were dispatched immediately, and within hours, they began to recover missing children. Wyatt sat at his desk, exhausted but resolute. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they were making progress. He thought of Alex, Layla, and Malik, of the courage it had taken for Alex to speak out. It was a reminder of why they were fighting so hard. As the sun rose over the city, Wyatt allowed himself a brief moment of hope. The network was beginning to unravel, and justice was finally within reach. Justice and healing. Officer Wyatt sat in the precinct conference room, the table in front of him buried under stacks of evidence. Photos, contracts, and testimonies formed a harrowing mosaic of the trafficking network they had begun to dismantle. The raid on the estate had yielded crucial information, and more children were being located with each passing hour. But despite the progress, Wyatt felt the weight of unfinished business pressing heavily on his shoulders. Across from him, Detective Elena Price leaned back in her chair, her expression weary but determined. "Calloway's still refusing to cooperate," she said, pushing a folder toward Wyatt. "But we've got enough to charge him with conspiracy, child endangerment, and trafficking. He's going away for a long time." Wyatt opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. "That's not enough," he said quietly. "We need the rest of the network. We need to bring every single one of these monsters down." Elena nodded. "Agreed. But we also need to make sure these kids, Alex, Layla, Malik, and the others, are safe and supported. This isn't just about arrests. It's about giving them a chance to heal."